Hello? Does the mic work? Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Please take a seat, those who are still having a sandwich. So my name is Gregory Kless. I'm a researcher here at Bruegel. It's my pleasure to host you today and to be the chair of this event. On behalf of Bruegel, let me first thank the audience for being here and our speakers for accepting our invitation to come to speak about labor market reforms in Europe and the Flexicurity model. So before I introduce all the speakers and we start the discussion, I also want to highlight that this event is a collaboration with the think tank Demos, a British think tank, with which we are going to organize a series of events on the topic of labor market transformation and the economic impact, but also the social impact, because Demos is focusing more on political science and sociology. So we'll discuss that in this event, but also in the next event that we'll organize in London. Demos is represented here today by Philip Collins, who is here on my left, who is the chair of the board of trustees of Demos. I'll just give you the floor for a minute so that you can explain to our audience what is Demos exactly and what you do. Okay?
Lovely. Thank you very much. You will all have noticed this is a very important day for the European Union's relationship with the United Kingdom. And I speak, of course, of this seminar and the relationship between Demos and Bruegel, which we're delighted about. And as you say, we're very keen to ensure that it persists. The United Kingdom may well be in the departure lounge of this institution, but many of the trends that we observe back at home, the labour market trends, are independent of political structures. They're of course influenced by them, but they have an existence quite separate from political structures, and so we're very keen to explore the differences and the similarities between our experience and the experience elsewhere. Demos has been traditionally, for the 25 years of its existence, a domestic think tank, but we are very keen to change that, and under the guidance of Sophie Gaston, who leads our international program, we are belatedly looking out to the world. It's extraordinary that we're doing so just at the moment that the United Kingdom seems to be looking inward at itself. We will, in our own little way, try and redress that balance.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's really a pleasure for us to have you here and to have this collaboration with Demos. Thank you also, Sophie and Giuseppe, for organizing this collaboration. So basically, the idea of today's event is to discuss the recent wave of labor market reforms that have taken place in Europe since the crisis for many countries like France, Italy, but also before the crisis for Germany. And basically, what we try to do is to share some country experience about the reforms, but also how the post-reform labor market fit with the Flexicurity model. Because the objective is not only to reduce unemployment, but also to change the labor markets of the European countries in order to have a more flexible, but also a more secure market for workers. So we'll try to see how those reforms took place, what are the outcomes of those reforms, and what will happen in the future for the countries that are still in the process of reforming their labor markets. So we have a great panel of speakers today to discuss this, coming from all over Europe to have a point of view from each country's perspective. The order will be the following. So first, we'll have Garance Pinault, who is an advisor in the cabinet of the Minister of Labor in France, who is replacing Antoine Fouché, who was supposed to be here today, but was not available at the end. But we are really glad to have Garance with us. Then we'll have Marco Leonardi, who is a full professor of economics at the University of Milan, but also an economic advisor at the Prime Minister's office in Italy. Then we'll have Werner Eichhorst, sorry for your name, I try to pronounce it well, who is the Director of Labor Policy for Europe at ISA, so the Institute for Labor Economics. Then Phil, so as I said, the chair of Demos Board of Trustees, but also a writer at the Times, will speak about the labor market in the UK. And finally, last but not least, we'll have Maria Jepsen, who is associate professor in labor economics at the ULB and director of research department at the European Trade Union Institute, who will give us like our views, broader views, like a comparative approach views on all those European market reforms and how they fit with this flexicurity model that has been first created in your home country, Denmark. So let me give the floor immediately to Garance, who will explain us what's happening in France at the moment.
Thank you very much, Gregory. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. We are very happy to be here and to talk about this very important flexicurity issue. First, I need to apologize because, as you said, Antoine Fouché, so the head of cabinet of the minister, was supposed to be with you today, and for some reason, very unexpected national circumstances, is not able to do it today. He's very sorry for that, and for same reasons, I will have to leave you a bit earlier before the end of the session. So I'm very, very sorry for that. I'm very happy to be here because basically what we are trying to achieve in France since last May is basically the design of a French-style flexicurity model. That means, I mean, the minister always uses the same formula, which I give you now, which is unleash energies, protect people, and create jobs. So basically, the idea is to try to strike the right balance between social and economic objectives. On one hand, give business more flexibility so that it can grow and create jobs, and on the other hand, try to secure career paths so that people are protected, more agile, but more protected in tomorrow's world of work, knowing that in 10 years, 50% of the jobs will be different or transformed. So flexicurity, I think we addressed the first part of the challenge with the recent labor law reform that was passed at the end of September this year. Maybe a few words before I enter a bit into the details of the measures on the reasons why it was so important for the president and the minister to introduce this reform rapidly. We'll maybe mention only 4 of them. The first one is, of course, the level of unemployment, 9.7% in France in 2017, which is, of course, much too high, higher than many of our European partners. 25% of the youth do not have a job in France. This is, of course, totally unacceptable, and this is the main reasons why we needed to change things. Second is probably something around the French labor market dualism. 90% of the hirings in France today are with temporary contracts, which is an important trend to take into account. Third reason was probably we needed to send strong signals to investors and to foreign investors to make sure that French economy would remain attractive. We are convinced that we have many assets, but for some good or bad reasons, some rigid labor regulation was perceived as extremely rigid in some areas. So we wanted to send a message towards them. And fourth reason, and this is a very, very important for us, and maybe particularly for me because I'm specifically doing and dealing with international and European issues for the minister, was to send a signal to our European partners. Because, of course, the president is totally convinced that our future lies in Europe, that Europe as it stands, as it works, needs to be changed. We have, and he started to deliver or to give some ideas about our European agenda, but for that we needed to be more credible and to give some signals to our partners to just saying, well, France is able to move, we're able to make reforms. So that's the 4, I guess, more reasons why we wanted to do it as in the first place, because this is the first reform that we implemented when we came into office. Maybe to sum up the spirit of the reforms, 3 main points. The first one, 3 blocks, I would say. The first one is, of course, that the labor market is more flexible now. Most topics are now addressed at the company level, so wages, working time, bonuses, some topics that were previously addressed by the law or by the sector are now addressed at the company level, which of course allows to take into consideration the specificities of each employer's and employees' needs. It just comes from the fact that you do not have the same needs when you're a digital startup or a large enterprise in the automotive sector, for example. Then employers will have the ability to better adapt and adapt more swiftly to upward, downward markets, and to negotiate on, for example, again, working time or wages, depending on the business climate, which is, again, very important in terms of flexibility. That's the first big block. The second block is about we have created a new framework for termination rules. Termination rules will be more secured and more clear for employers and employees. The first measure that we decided and was very much commented was the capping of damages in labor courts. So many of our European partners had already done it previously. In France, there was no cap, so now there's one, which of course gives brings legal certainty for employers, and this is also more equitable for workers. The third block is about social dialogue, which is now more, which is simpler and more efficient. We did basically two things. The first one is the merger of the three information and consultation bodies. We had three staff delegates, works council, and health and safety committees. Now you will have only one, which is called the Social and Economic Council. And the important thing here is that for the first time, you will be able to address the topics at the same table by the same people. So it makes social dialogue even really more efficient. Second measures in terms of simplicity of social dialogue, the law makes it simpler for SMEs and micro businesses, because now the employers have the ability to negotiate directly with staff delegates for companies with less than 50 employees, and directly with employees in companies with less than 20 employees. So social dialogue is just simpler to implement. And this comes from a very simple fact, is that 96% of SMEs did not have any kind of trade union representation anyway. So we needed to find a way to allow social dialogue in such structures, which are, of course, the highest number of enterprises in France. So basically, that's the main measures that were implemented at the end of September. I think the key word here is social dialogue, because then there is nothing possible without collective bargaining and collective agreements. But now employers and employees have the tools to implement what they need at the enterprise level. But they need to use these tools now. So that's the challenge and what we will monitor in the coming months and coming years. That was the flex part. Now we're entering in the second phase, which is the security part. So I will not go into details now, but just to give you the 4 areas of focus that will be and the measures that will be implemented in the coming months. And everything I'm telling you now will probably end up in a law next spring, so April or May. The first one is massive investment in skills. 15 billion euros will be available over the next 5 years, dedicated to long-term unemployed and needs, 1.3 million needs in France. Second is the reform of vocational training, which basically is very complex. The government does not work. It's not equitable, because then basically the one who benefits vocational training today are not the ones who would need it the most. So we'll do something. Social partners already started to negotiate on this. They will be probably finished by mid-February, so we'll see afterwards what comes out of the negotiation. Third, enhance apprenticeships, because you have only 7% of young French people apprentices versus, for example, 16 or 17 in Germany. So the idea here is not to copy-paste a German model on this, even if it's, of course, a very inspirational model in terms of training and apprenticeship, but it's to look at what works in some countries, and in this regard, I think Germany is a very good example. But basically, if you look at all countries where apprenticeship is high and youth unemployment is low, the systems always lie on the same on common principles, and at least two: the close association of business or sectors in the design of the training contents. And second, limit public funding. I think that, again, so Germany has 3 times more apprentices than in France, but 3 times less public funds in each apprentice. So we need to find a way to incentivize employers to invest in training, and in particular in apprentices. And the fourth block, and the last thing, I think I'm okay, is the reform of the unemployment benefit system, where basically we want to do 2 things: to open it up to some other categories of workers, so independent workers and people who want to quit their jobs. So the details and the modalities are not decided yet. And to find a way to incentivize again employers to hire under permanent contracts to have an impact over the dualism I was mentioning at the very beginning. So just a final word on the fact that everything is, all these measures I'm mentioning here has to be seen as a system. In the president's view and the minister's view, things will change only if everything is implemented, and it's only like that will have an impact over the overall of the French social model.
Thanks for this overview of the French system. You have some fan in the audience, apparently. So now we can move to Italy and to Marco Leonardi, who has been part of the team working on the Job Act, and he will explain us what has changed in the Italian labor market, but also if we are starting to see results, because it was implemented a few years ago already, and he will tell us how it moved the Italian labor market towards a more secure labor model. So please.
I have some slides. I don't need to put them all on show, but only a few of them. I think the Jobs Act was put in place in 2015, started in March 2015, so now we are 2 years and a half after implementation. Just to review the main characteristics, the first was a big incentive in terms of exemption from social security contributions for 3 years for all new open-ended contracts signed during 2015, and a reduction of 40% for all those contracts signed in 2016. So the first part was a big hiring incentive, and the second part was this. So a design of a schedule of compensation, monetary compensation for firing, individual firing, economic and disciplinary, basically both types of firing, in terms of monetary compensation instead of the reinstatement that used to be the case and is still the case for all those contracts that are prior to March 2015. So nowadays, Italian labor market works in the following way. Basically 50% of people, or a bit more, still on the old regime with the protection of reinstatement in case they go to court and the judge rules in favor of the employees, they can be reinstated in the job, and a bit less than 50% of the employees instead that are already on the new regime, whereby if they get fired, they can choose basically between a fast-track settlement, 1 month per year of tenure, starting from 2 months to 18 months. Fast-track means that it's that you find an agreement between the employer and the employee, and the schedule there is tax-free. It contributed a lot to the decrease in the trials. So litigation has gone down by 30% over. We have only accumulated data, so we are accumulating data from 2014 to now by more or less 30%. So it's a big decrease in litigation for labor market issue, non-labor market issues. Fast-track settlement is the first choice. If instead you want to go to court, of course you go to court, and in the case the judge rules in your favor as an employee, you get the red line. So the basic point here is that the judge has no way of choosing any sum of money in between the two lines or over the red line. So the basic idea of this reform was to make the cost of firing certain more than establishing a level of the cost of firing. Certain because at most you get the red line, so you get 4 months minimum up to 24 months maximum if you have 12 years of tenure in the firm. So basically this is the main reform of the Jobs Act, and it was designed to give an incentive to open-ended contracts, both by way of monetary incentives, the hiring incentives that I spoke about before, and in terms of certainty in the firing costs ex post. The first results, then I get to the other, sorry that I prepared a longer presentation, but I didn't have an exact idea of how it was structured. The first results, I think one important result is this. Of course, these are the numbers of permanent and temporary employment. You see the blue line is permanent employment. We were seeing a decreasing trend for a few years before 2014. In 2015 and 16, we had a big increase in permanent employment, and we are back now to the pre-crisis level. But we also seen an increase in temporary employment. Nowadays, can be explained by the fact that temporary employment it's always very elastic to the business cycle, but we believe that actually there is a bit too much temporary employment, in the sense that if you do these reforms to give a clear message that you want the open-ended contract to be the most common contract in the labor market. Here we see this is employment growth in the main European countries. You see Italy has seen a big employment growth in the last couple of years. Actually, the elasticity with the GDP growth is much higher than any other country. We have slow GDP growth, but relatively high employment growth. you see that employment grew more than in other countries. But you also see that in the last year, when the hiring incentives have disappeared, because in 2017 there was no hiring incentive, the whole the line there, the column is completely blue. It means that the whole employment growth happens to be in fixed-term contracts rather than open-ended contracts. So here we have a positive, and without doubt, a positive effect on employment of this reform that I showed in the slide before. But we also have an issue of the composition of employment, because we believe that that this share of temporary contracts is too high. Why is too high? Without doubt, there is an issue of a political problem. We have elections now, and all reforms, of course, in all elections are put in some kind of uncertainty. And but this is not, I think it's not only in Italy, but in particularly this was a very successful, I think, reform during the past 3 years, because it happened in a relatively quiet, there was not a single hour of strike during the implementation of the Jobs Act. But now the elections are coming up, and of course all parties are putting forward new reforms, and sometimes some of them are putting forward also an issue of going back to the previous regime. I tell you because it's all over the newspapers now, and it's no case, there is no way of saying anything else. Of course, we believe that this is a very important reform that will stay in place. It's clear that elections, of course, bring many new surprises. Every time you have elections, you have surprises. We are trying to see whether there is a space for correcting the Jobs Act, in the sense of putting some limits on the regulations of the fixed-term contracts, because we have a very liberal regulation of fixed-term contracts, more than in France and Germany and Spain, because we have a maximum duration of 3 years, when I think France and Germany is 2 years, and we have a number of renewals that is up to 5 during the 3 years. You can renew the contract 5 times during the 3 years, and instead I believe it's 2 or 3 times maximum in France and Germany. So we have a liberal regulation of fixed-term contracts, which is also part of this problem. If I have a couple of more minutes, 2 minutes, but this is the main issue. The main issue, I think, the most interesting part is this. Of course, the Jobs Act, without showing you the slides, the Jobs Act is made of 3 legs. This is only the first leg, I think the most important. The second point was the reform of the unemployment benefits, with an enlargement of eligibility. And the third leg is active labor market policies, where we are finding some problems in implementation, because this is a competence that the constitution gives to the regions rather than the state. And of course, we tried with the referendum in last December, but it didn't work out, and now we are still with the regional competence that has to be put in line with a reform that was thought to be on the central level. So we introduced a national agency, a national instrument, national policy for carrying out active labor market policies, and now we are facing also during the elections, of course, these problems are exacerbated, but we are facing difficulty in putting all the regions in line to implement this reform.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Marco. Let's go to Germany now, where Werner will. Can you please pass me the? Where Werner will discuss, in fact, the labor market reforms of the 2000s. And given that Germany is now an inspiration, as we have heard before Garon saying that, we want to know what went well, what went bad, if there are some shortcomings of the labor market reforms in Germany. Of course, we all know that the unemployment rate is great and that many countries would like to have the same. But what about dualism of the labor market and other features?
Thank you very much, Gregory. Thank you very much also for the invitation. And maybe we can somehow turn on yes, the screen. I want to be brief, but I think one thing that we should bear in mind is that the reforms in Germany somehow occurred 15 years ago. So that means somehow in an asynchronous fashion compared to maybe the French and the Italian ones. But Germany was in a state of crisis in the early 2000s after the new economy bubble, and we had a rising unemployment rate between 2000 and 2002. We were not able to meet the Maastricht criteria at the time. So this basically triggered a couple of reforms that I would still like to get back to show it to you in a minute. That way. Where is it? Okay. Okay, great. So I have to shoot at him. Okay, I see. Great. So what is basically happening? The first thing that we should bear in mind is that for the permanent contracts, basically no legal changes were implemented. So this basically continued, with the exception of a couple of minor issues, but there was a strong change in the system of industrial relations, declining collective bargaining coverage and also decentralization, a bit similar to what France is currently going to, but at a lower level of organization and coverage. And the second thing, I think this is important to explain some of the changes in the German labor market was deregulation of non-standard types of employment, in a way quite typical, I think, for many continental European countries, including France and Italy nowadays, together with an activation policy that was implemented in Germany after 2002. From a labor market perspective, this has basically affected the labor supply. So mobilizing labor supply was the main issue here, through stricter availability criteria, to some cuts in benefits, and to more efficient and more effective active labor market policy, some changes in the benefit system, but not necessarily a cut in the coverage or an expansion in the coverage of unemployed by benefits. So this is still one of the highest rates in terms of coverage that we have in Europe, still to be found in Germany. And this deregulatory approach to basically stimulate labor demand at a time, mostly to be expected through the deregulation of temporary agency work. This was one of the key topics, to bring unemployed or inactive people into the labor market, and short-time, part-time work called mini job, where people could earn up to 450 euros without having any deduction of taxes and social security contributions. So this somehow was designed to stimulate small jobs, bringing in additional people into the labor market, but at the same time also solving some of the labor cost issues in the private service sector, and also encouragement of small self-employment. Reorganization of employment services, I think this is also basically in line with the mainstream of that period, making the public employment service more effective, organizing it around certain performance criteria, and also involving private service providers. Additional policies to increase labor market participation, female labor supply, in particular better care policies, and the removal of early retirement. So all these things, I think, have made a contribution to a situation where we now have a higher employment rate. What I also want to stress every time I talk about the German model is that standard employment is still dominant and this is stable. So it has not been eroding after the reforms. But what we have seen, in fact, is an increase in non-standard types of employment. And I would say there's still an issue regarding the quality of some of those jobs, but also in terms of the probability of making a transition from a non-standard type of employment to a permanent type of employment. This is particularly true for agency workers and for those marginal part-time workers. I would also argue that for the fixed-term contracts, the issue is less problematic than maybe in France or in Italy, with transition rates of 45% or so from one year to the next. But in fact, I would definitely say that the German labor market is now a bit more dualized than it used to be. But the positive side of this change is definitely that the labor market has become more permeable or more open for unemployed and also for inactive people. And this you can see in this graph where we can see this growing, let's say, wedge of non-standard types of employment, basically at the expense of unemployment and inactivity. So I don't have to go into details here, I think. And this we can, of course, also discuss a bit more in detail regarding the temporary agency work. There has been some research into the actual functioning of agency work in Germany, pointing in particular at the fact that in the manufacturing sector, this has taken some of the regular employment. Yeah, so there was a limited piece of crowding out occurring where agency workers could somehow work side by side with direct employees, but under different working conditions, including also different types of collective agreements and pay schemes. This raised some criticism later on that I will come back to in a minute. The same basically could be observed with the marginal part-time work, where this was most pervasive, in particular in the hospitality sector and in the retail sector. There was some replacement of fully socially insured regular employment by this new highly flexible, but in a way also cheaper types of employment. And this basically affected different types of occupations quite asymmetrically. I would in particular highlight the top right quadrant of this graph, showing you those occupations like salespersons, for example, where there was an increase in jobs available, at the same time an increase in non-standard jobs in total employment in their respective occupations. I think this is somehow the typical response that occurred in the German service sector that generated most of the jobs after the mid-2000s up to now. So the situation, I think, could have stopped here. The whole discussion about Germany was a story about somewhat more dualizing labor market, but something has changed in the current decade. I think this should not be underrated and gives at least some idea how policy responses can look like. We have seen the positive development in employment, declining unemployment, but less so in terms of long-term unemployment. This is one of the issues that we still have to observe. There was also increasing criticism regarding the growth of atypical types of employment and low pay. So this was one of the issues that became more and more prominent in the late 2000s and early 2010s. At the same time, trade unions changed their strategy and were much more in favor of having a statutory minimum wage. This was not an issue for the trade unions until very recently, but only with the growth of the low-pay sector and their limited capacity to organize the labor market, they started to ask for a statutory minimum wage. And this was introduced then in 2015. So in a way, one can argue this is somehow a policy response or a policy reversal compared to the more flexibility-oriented liberalizing reforms of the early 2000s. And somehow ironically also in 2017 some of the deregulation that was implemented in 2003 regarding the temporary agency work sector was also reversed in terms of maximum assignments and in terms of delayed equal pay clause, for example, with some exceptions in terms of sectoral agreements that are still possible. So, to summarize, one last slide. Again, let's try. Yeah, I think the positive thing is massive unemployment could be overcome, employment could be stimulated, in particular in the service sector. This was not possible under the old system. We have seen this somehow dual path to flexibility internally through changes in collective agreements and in company practices, and on the other hand, a reorganization of non-standard employment and labor market policies. Last point that I would like to stress is that this is not a one-way street going to ever more flexibility, but at some point there's also a policy response given widespread public uneasiness with some of the outcomes, and this I think can be taken as an explanation for what has occurred over the last 2 or 3 years in a much more favorable economic environment.
Thanks very much, Werner, for this good explanation of the German model. I pass now the floor to Phil, who will talk about the UK labor market, and in particular, I think about the problem of productivity that you have at the moment in the UK.
Thank you very much. I'm already aware how different the UK is from all the others, from what we've heard. The last time I was in Brussels on a work venture, I was with the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and we were here to do a speech at the European Parliament. And we were here in the hotel with a speech that I'd written, which was, and I can say this, just about the dullest speech anybody would have ever been forced to sit through. It was full of protocols and piety about the European Union. Britain was about to become the president of the European Union at that time. And then that day on the floor of the Parliament, somebody called Jean-Claude Juncker made a really withering speech about the British contribution to the European Union, in particular the budget, which had just been scuppered on his view by the British. And so we tore up my boring speech and we wrote a completely different one in a few hours. And that speech has 2 notable elements which I think are relevant still today. The first is the main refrain of the speech, which was a biblical cadence. The people are blowing the trumpets on the city walls, but is anybody listening? And that was a direct challenge to the European Union on its labour markets. It turns out in Britain, the people were blowing the trumpets on the city walls and the governments of the day were not listening. The second part of the speech, which is notable, is that it was an attempt to answer the accusation that Britain had an Anglo-Saxon model. The British labour market was fundamentally different from the European model by choice and by design, and the inference was that the British thought their model was superior. And we wanted to answer all of those things in the negative, to say we did not think of ourselves as being an Anglo-Saxon labour market, and we did not, the following inference didn't also apply. We did not think our model was superior, but it was certainly different. And the speech was an attempt to define what we said was the British social model, which of course is extremely extensive. The 1945 welfare state was an extremely strongly formulated and structured attempt to provide social protection, largely successful. The reputation for having an economy which is more intent on flexibility than on security, of course, is owed to the liberalisation of the 1980s under the Thatcher government. So, of course, there's something to it. I'm not denying that there was a liberalisation which was very explicitly done along American lines. The government of that era very decidedly looked to the United States for its inspiration. And some of the consequences of that were a huge freeing up of the labour market from the point of view of an employer, certainly. After an initial huge burst of unemployment, it was easier to hire people. But of course, income inequality really took off during that decade in a way it had never done so before. There's a couple of others really important differences I'd just like to highlight with the UK, which are independent of any government's identity. And one of which is, as I listen to the other speakers, I'm conscious how little of a conversation takes place in Britain on these questions. There's less of a bargain. Before I was involved in Demos, I used to run a think tank called the Social Market Foundation, and we were absolutely inspired by the German idea. So I'm very aware of the notion of the social market, not where the social is not a caveat upon the market, it's a compound term. The market is a social institution which has social consequences. Now, that's not a familiar argument in Britain, which has a very polarised political culture. There are advocates of the state and there are advocates of the market. And we're also a very centralised state, which means that even on things like wage rates across the country, it's very common for them to be centralised. There was a long argument in the Labour movement between the trade unions and the Labour Party about whether a national minimum wage was a good idea or not. Because, of course, legislation underpins wage rates, but it also takes the trade unions out of the conversation. So that bargaining and that sense of collaboration is not extensive in Britain. We do not have the labour market institutions that are common, for example, in Germany. And that's true on the employer's side, and it's true on the labour side. So the participants in the conversation, which make a good organic process in some countries in its labour market, are not developed in the UK. Nevertheless, the Blair years were full of attempts to add protection to the labour market. Trade union recognition was made compulsory. The national minimum wage was established. There was lots of childcare legislation. Tax credits were added as a supplement to wages. There were huge education reforms. Welfare state entitlements were reformed as well. It was a very active government in the labour market. The crash of 2007 is a much bigger event for an economy like the United Kingdom than it is for most economies, for the obvious reason that a greater proportion of British GDP comes from financial services, and a very high proportion of our tax revenues come from that source. So as a consequence, the response to that crash was proportionately greater in the United Kingdom, which meant, given we by then had a coalition government dominated by the Conservatives, what they called austerity, which is to say drastic reductions in public spending, where the greater part of the burden in those reductions was taken in the welfare state, which is to say some of the supplements to the labour market. And so that has had a huge impact over the last decade, and a great deal of social protection that was built up over time in the Labour years has been reduced or in some cases lost. That's put the UK in a position where we have nevertheless got very high employment, because the virtue of the flexibility that was produced during the 1980s remains there. And we've gone through a very tough economic period, but it has not been a period in which unemployment has risen highly at all, despite lots of predictions that it would. Britain has its highest ever employment rate at the moment in its history, and that's in spite of, or it may be because of, in part, very considerable immigration historically. So Britain's employment rate has been a great success. However, that has come alongside a lot of low status, low pay work. So it may be that these two things, you have to have the two of them. We haven't yet figured out a way to get the one without the other, but that's what we've got. That's what we've produced. There's a lot of people in precarious work, a lot of people in work which is of a lower quality than they would wish, a lot of people who are in part-time work, who don't want to be in part-time work. Flexibility is great if it's providing what the people want, but there's a lot of evidence that British people would like to work more than they are able to at the moment. So that's not a policy success. We've also seen in Britain, we're much further down the road than the United States has travelled in the shift of power from labour to capital. And that is seen in the share of the social product taken in markets by shareholders. But it's also seen very significantly in the fact that the average British worker has not had a pay rise for a decade. And the Office for Budget Responsibility in our annual budget a couple of weeks ago pointed out that that situation is likely to persist for another decade. So that would then be 20 years in which the average worker has not had a real terms pay rise, which would be unprecedented and obviously is finding its way into our politics. That is, I would say, the most significant fact in British life, let alone in the British labour market. This is a position we're in, and we've also now got a government as a result of our decision to leave the European Union, which is essentially unable to act, because the government, in its wisdom, decided to have a general election to secure a firmer mandate for its negotiation position, and was promptly rewarded with a much weaker position that it started with. So we've got a government which is finding it very difficult to do anything other than stutter towards the exit of the European Union. So there's not a great deal of reform going on in the United Kingdom on anything at all. There's two things which are in the system, which are in this field. One is the huge reform to the welfare state known as universal credit. Well, I say it's huge. It began as huge. It's rapidly becoming very small. It was an attempt to wrap up lots of benefits into a single code with the intention to be to improve work incentives. As the austerity has really scuppered that ambition, and the more they take out of the pot, the less the incentives are sharp to enable people to get back into work. And the second thing, which introduced last week, or announced last week again, is a very tepid and not very inspired industrial strategy. The government is desperately searching for reforms which require no legislation, because without a majority in the lower house, it's very difficult to push through any legislation. An industrial strategy could be enacted without the need for votes in Parliament, but there's not a great deal in it. There's not a great deal of enthusiasm in the governing party for it. There were yet again, a few warm words about technical education, which I would say is the single biggest reason for Britain's terrible record on productivity, and we have never addressed this. And the missing part of the 1945 welfare state was the proposal that we would have a series of technical colleges, and they never appeared. So Britain educates its top 10% of its population better than anywhere else in the world, and the bottom 40% probably worse than any other developed economy. And at the moment, there's no great political desire to do anything about that. So, finally, where does that leave us? Just a couple of days ago, the Commission, the Social Mobility Commission, which is a body which oversees the government's attempts to increase the equality of opportunity in Britain, all four of the commissioners resigned, saying the government has no interest in doing anything on this. And they had a very interesting report in which they identified 65 hotspots where equality was very low. And of those 65, 60 of them voted to leave the European Union. In 60 of those places, the people were sounding the trumpets on the city walls. And in the end, I think the decision of the United Kingdom to leave the EU is a verdict not on the EU. It's virtually nothing to do with the European Union, but it is a verdict on what's happening in British labour markets.
Thanks very much, Phil, for this statement. Now let's go to Maria, because as you have seen, it's true that all those reforms that have been taking place in Europe, in the UK in the 80s, in Germany in the 2000s, and in Italy in 2015, and now in France, it seems that they have succeeded in increasing employment, but we also see that they have some shortcomings. We have been discussing about increase in dualism, increase in short-term contracts, increase in inequality, low wages. So I wanted to have your views on if you think that this reform have really transformed the labor market of those countries into something that looks like flexicurity, like the ones that we have in Denmark, or if they are still very far from that model, and what could be done in those countries to push the labor market towards this flexicurity model.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I have to say, I was in Denmark last week talking to the Danish trade unions, and there the most popular person was Macron. Because obviously, Macron and his team has been traveling quite a lot to Denmark to figure out what's Denmark all about, what are they doing. And I haven't seen any French person being so popular since the Queen married the French Crown Prince, right? So that was kind of a discovery for me. So now, I mean, what can we expect from the labor market reforms that have taken place? I think, there's the German where you can actually say something because we've got some research. We've got the Italian where it happened, but only half of it happened. And then we got the French, which is just rolling out right now. So, it's kind of a very difficult. And then the UK, where we can have a discussion about also whether these reforms actually generated the employment in the UK. But going back to Germany, now there's quite a big discussion within German academia as well to, what did actually generate the employment, yes or no. And some scholars would say, yeah, but it was the Hart reforms who did it. And I think no scholar would say that had nothing to do with it. But in general, there's also quite a lot of research that shows that, okay, that the timing of the reforms
was what was important in this sense, because it happened while there was a big external demand, global demand for the kind of goods that Germany produced. Germany was taking advantage of the enlargement, so they were outsourcing, they were offshoring and so forth, and so they were just very strategic in terms of positioning themselves in the global market, and were able to hinge themselves on in a rather rapid and good way to the global demand. And so we had kind of a simultaneity between the reforms and the growth in employment. And at the same time, what we also had in this sense was that the trade unions and the employers in the sectors that were export bound basically started negotiating on other issues. Okay, so there were a lot of other kind of factors that did that we had this simultaneity between labor market reforms and the fact that unemployment went down. Okay, so employment per head has gone up to a certain extent, but if we look at the volume of work, it has not gone up in Germany. And I think this is true for most countries in the European Union, actually, that on the volume of work we're stagnating to a certain extent. So did the labor market reforms then actually create more employment? Did it actually decrease the unemployment? There's not one factor that's contributing to it. And I think that what's really important in Germany was that the timing of it. There was a demand engine on the outside that was actually able to pull employment and unemployment down. And I think that the situation of France and Italy is not quite similar these days. No, it is another context. So that my first point is in terms of what we can observe from Germany, and then what we think would happen today would be slightly different. Now with the UK, the reforms happened before. They happened in the 80s, and it completely transformed the labor market in the UK, and gave it a reputation of being this very poor, low quality. To a certain extent, it was exaggerated because it's not. There's a big heterogeneity in the labor market, but it has given spark to, as you say, a very subdued or constant wage for a large part of the UK population, and this is creating a lot of problems internally in the economy, and the bargaining position of workers has been immensely decreased. So what's the next move that's going to kind of ensure that there can be some kind of negotiation or some kind of discussion about what work organization is about, where the company is going to head, and where this economy is going to head? It's very difficult for somebody like me to actually see these days, right? So. And I don't necessarily think there need to be a trade-off. You said you haven't quite figured out how there is a trade-off, but I think we do have certain economies where the trade-off has been much less pronounced between employment and precarious employment, and Scandinavian countries being one of them. And I think one of the issues with regard to this is that EPL is not an obsession. If you look to a lot of the Nordic kind of countries, the EPL is not the obsession. What is the obsession is that we need to keep productivity gains, productivity growth, more or less growing, because that's what's what's paying the welfare state. This is what's going to pay for the wages and so forth and so forth. So you have quite a different discussion, which is a discussion about training. It's a discussion about investment. It's a discussion about lifelong learning and so forth to have a productive workforce. And then you get into kind of another bind. And this also then shapes the way that you put forward your active labor market policy and the kind of money you're ready to invest into it. This then brings me to the Italian case and the French case, because as our French colleagues said, it's the flexibility part of the reforms that have been kind of put into place. And now we get to the security. Italy did all of the reforms, but they haven't quite figured out how to carry out the security part of it. So the employment service, public employment services, which is extremely important in terms of being able to help unemployed into employment. To have active labor market policies that are actually not just pushing people into precarious employment via incentive structures that basically push people into anything, but actually into an active labor market policy that looks at education and training and so forth. So this part is very expensive, and it requires that you build up institutions, that you have institutional learning, institutional innovation, and it's not just something that's going to spring out of ground, especially when you're in a very, very difficult situation in your labor market and you're under financial constraint, okay? Because you need to go in and invest heavily. You need to admit that you're going to fail on some points, and you need to do the innovation and the institutional learning that takes it. And to do this in a space where you don't have money, it's difficult, right? It's just difficult. So I think that, so those are some of the, the Danish, when Denmark, well, it's a very, very old system, right? But they did actually do a qualitative jump, also with regard to how to decrease unemployment and to maybe reformulate the unemployment benefit system. But the year that there was an agreement, tripartite agreement on this one, the Danish government actually went from a public surplus to a deficit of 5%, which meant they said, okay, we'll jump off the cliff, but we'll push the economy into growth, and we'll do it together. So it was kind, and I think this is what we need to. I mean, for some of these reforms to actually have some kind of chance, if we look around, the growth, economic growth, is of vital importance, and you can't. I mean, if you want to do these reforms without some kind of push in terms of getting the wheels to move, you will end up pushing people into precarious situations, and then afterwards you're going to have to do like Germany, is to figure out how do we get ourselves out of this situation now, right? And so the minute jobs is still there, but the minimum wage actually did a part of the trick, right? Because once you got in a tight labor market, you get minimum wages up, then people are starting to be pushed out of the minute jobs. And this actually basically suits everybody. Germany doesn't want to kill the minute jobs. Nobody really likes them. But, the minimum wage basically puts a large part of some of the people out of it. On the temporary work agency, I think in 2011, there was another kind of attempt to kind of re-regulate the temporary agency workers. At this point, the reaction from the companies, and this will get me then to my last point, switched from using temporary agency workers to self-employed. Because the fact was that the temporary agency workers became more or less as expensive as core workers after a certain period. So the strategy of the firms was to move into a segment of the labor market that was still cheaper and as flexible, right? And I think that's a point that we need to learn from, is that we look across European Union today, is that we see some of the attempts to kind of re-regulate or try to reinstate that the standard employment relationship is the employment relationship that we actually want to look into, is very difficult. It's very difficult because you can put into place the laws, but the companies and the organization need to follow it, right? On the other hand, we see that we open up the spaces for some kind of, for using more kind of atypical contracts, whatever it can mean. This is being used, meaning that deregulating seems to be a path that is being used, but the re-regulation is a kind of a more difficult path to put companies down. And if we then look at how companies organize themselves, so what kind of companies do we have across Europe? What are their characteristics? How do they organize work? How do they interact? And how do they perceive their human resources? We see large differences across the European Union as well. So there are several studies that have been put out in terms of what can characterize functioning of work, of the work organization. And here, another difference that we see as well in terms of how the labor law, or how the way that security is organized kind of fits into the way the companies work, is we have the learning companies. So the companies that use employee that consults, that have employee-driven innovation, where there's a lot of autonomy in the work and so forth. They are also the countries where one can see the flexicurity very prominent. Okay, so there is some kind of complementarity between the way that company works and the way that you can organize your labor market institutions. If you then kind of say, okay, what will this mean for Italy and for France? You see, for Italy, this is not what characterizes most companies. Companies are organized in a very different way. They function in a very different way. So how are they going to be able to engage with these new labor market configuration? For me, is an open question. I would be very interested to see down the line a positive effect, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because if a company organizes itself so they have routine tasks and so forth, they don't need a workforce that has the experience of the company, that can innovate and so forth and so forth. They need another kind of workforce. So I think that combination is very interesting. And we go to France, it's in the middle way. So can it work or can it not work? I think the jury is still very much out there. And I also think it very much depends on how the social partners in France will be able to engage into this reconfiguration of their industrial relations, which is not an easy issue as well, especially when you are in a low growth and in a situation of fiscal constraint.
Thanks very much for for the statement. Before I give the floor to the audience, do you want to react to each other's, or I can give to yeah? Okay, then just yeah, so many questions. I'll start with Mr. Zaire. Yeah, please tell your name and your affiliation.
It was not the hard for reform, it was the wage bill stand started already in the 80s. Macron is also popular in Sweden and Norway. I don't know why, because he's paying some lip service to the Nordic model, but what he's doing at home is the opposite of the Nordic model with the decentralized bargaining structure. In the Scandinavian countries, we have central agreements, and you can bargain at local level to better agreements or less positive agreements. But it's not the Macron model. I read the Flexicurity, but what I see is more flexibility and less security. Flexicurity is 11 letters. It seems that flexi is only 5 of them, and 7 is on curity, but it's the wrong picture. It's given us more insecurity in the labor market, and we are still waiting for the security part of it. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I'll take a round of questions and comments. I see Francesco there.
Francesco Badia from Bruegel, and this is very much a follow-up to what has just been said. Do I interpret the general message that is coming from the panel that we have done the flexibility part, and now we need to do the security part in Europe, maybe except in Scandinavia, the security and the growth part. So that would be an important conclusion that would come from, because so far the emphasis has been flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. And now if you say, no, okay, that we have done, now let's move to security, that would be an important message coming from your panel. Thank you.
There was one question coming from Bernadette Segal there, and André also, and then...
It's not really a question, and it really follows what has been said. I think there is something very basic. Security is first for workers, the financial security they have when they are unemployed. And if you don't give them this security, you get what you have in the UK, political destabilization and, saying the EU is all the problem. I wish I could have passed this message to President Macron, but I think it's too late. I will have to have a direct line with him. But I think that is absolutely basic. If you are made unemployed, you need to continue to pay your rent, you have children. And this financial aspect seems to be completely forgotten. 20 years ago, when I heard for the first time the word flexicurity, it was very clear that the Danes, they had, 70%, 80% of their salary. And now this is off. So, be careful of the political consequences of what not you, or what we are doing in your, not you, of course, it's not personal.
André, Mr. behind André, and then Guntram also.
Yeah, André Sapir. There would be much to say. I think the panel was fascinating, and I was thinking of what I wrote back in 2004 about the efficient and equitable system, and which we're not. And I think one dimension, maybe that, not to make a long speech, I think one dimension perhaps that is missing in the discussion is to look only at the labor market dimension rather than at the social models, of which obviously the labor market institutions is a very important component. But I think there is another one which I think is important in those countries, Scandinavia, but as well Austria as well, and Netherlands, where you have had this both equitable and efficient systems, it's education. When I look at the UK, the UK was and still is, as you said, sort of an efficient system. It's an inequitable but efficient system. I think that the basic inefficiency, the basic inequity in the UK is about education. So people do enter into the labor market with very, very inequitable distribution of human capital. And I think that is really a big difference with Scandinavia, where you have also very high employment rates, even higher than in the UK, but people are endowed with much more equitable human capital, because the education system, which I think in Scandinavia is a fundamental part of the social models. For most of us, what we understand by social models is labor market institutions. And I think the great difference with Scandinavia is that they understand that education is fundamentally a part of the social model, not just the labor market institutions. I think that's where really other countries are not doing a good job. I was happy to hear the advisor from Paris to speak a little bit about what's ahead about education. But I think it needs to be much more fundamental reforms there. Yeah.
Hi, Matt Steinglass from The Economist. I had one question that I wanted to address to Maria, which is one of the other received wisdoms about flexicurity is that Denmark has it. But another one of these sort of questioning articles that I've read recently was a piece by Ronald Janssen where he tries to do a sophisticated analysis of job security guarantees and finds that Denmark actually is about at the OECD average. And I just wonder, are we working with a myth that isn't really accurate about the basis of the notion of flexicurity? And then secondly, I wonder if anybody, we didn't hear much talk about migration and especially about posted workers. Do anybody on the panel think that Macron's emphasis on the posted workers question is a distraction? Is this a real challenge to establishing common labor market norms across Europe, or how important is that?
Guntram, and then also on the first row, and then we'll take answers.
Yeah, I wanted to, Guntram Boy from Bruegel, I wanted to follow up to what André also said about basically education. And I think the one key question, and Maria, you mentioned it, is productivity, of course. And the Danish and the Scandinavian model is interesting because they have a very high productivity level. And so in such a high productivity environment where people are qualified, of course, moving from one job to another one may be much easier than in an environment where the general productivity levels are actually quite low, qualifications are low, but also the capital is quite low. So perhaps I also felt that sort of this link of productivity is a bit missing, especially in the Italian presentation. I was wondering whether we can hear a little bit more about, what can we do to increase the productivity so that people actually find an adequate job that pays a good salary.
After another round of questions, because there are so many questions. But before, let me give the floor back to the speakers. Who wants to start? Okay.
I just respond to your point about the UK. I agree with you very much that the inequality in educational qualifications is very important. As I said myself, is the missing part of the 1945 settlement. However, I don't think it's entirely the answer. Let's just imagine for a moment that Britain had exactly the same educational outcomes as the Scandinavian countries. Would that therefore mean that the British settlement was the same as the Scandinavian countries? No, it wouldn't. For this reason, our capitalism is considerably more unequal than theirs. The British government is in fact extremely active as an agent of redistribution. It's just that the thing it's redistributing is significantly more unequal as a starting point. And that's to do with the mix of our economy. It's the nature of our economy. The UK government and the United States government are more active to redistribute wealth than most European governments. if you just look at the redistribution at federal level. But that's because they start with something which is absolutely sort of dreadful. And so there's something about the nature of our economy as well, in addition to we exacerbate that problem with our educational output, but I'm not sure we would therefore entirely solve it. We need to do something about the nature of our economy as well. Now, whether or not you think the educational reforms would lead that change, perhaps they would, but it's not obvious necessarily that they would. Second point is on migration. I don't know about whether on Macron, but I should have mentioned migration more in what I said about the UK, because it's absolutely crucial, of course, in what's happening there. That immigration has been an enormously important political subject over the last decade, vastly in excess of the incidence of migration, but nevertheless it's been very, very important. And one thing which, again, where the UK differs in a very significant way from the other countries under discussion, is that our welfare state has lost almost all of its contributory element. I think this is crucial with respect to migration, because politically, if you can say to the public that new entrants to the country will not be in receipt of significant welfare benefits because they haven't paid in, because they haven't paid their insurance premiums, as it were, then you can settle a political argument. Whereas in the UK, we can't say that. It remains a myth that migrants are taking huge amounts of benefits. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's a fact, but it is nevertheless a very troublesome political question. And the demise of the contributory principle, which is now almost negligible in Britain, is, I think, quite a serious problem. And one of the ways in which we ought to respond to our departure from the EU would be to try and turn that back, to try and become a bit more European in the nature of our welfare state. The irony is we're Anglo-Saxon, but on exactly the opposite issue from what we usually thought of as being Anglo-Saxon on.
Okay, about the Danish myth. I mean, when we talk about employment protection legislation, we always refer to the OECD indicator, right? And that this is the indicator that we use. And I mean, there's quite a lot of research around that shows that it's not very accurate, it's not very good, but you know, this is what we've got. There are there's some alternative indicators that shows that actually the UK and the Danish workforce is better protected than indicated in the OECD indicator, but this indicator, which is located at, I think it's Cambridge, is not as, it doesn't count for as many countries as the one at OECD. So we keep on using the OECD. Now, it is true that in Denmark, the employment protection is negotiated. It's something that's negotiated, but it's still fairly lower than in most European countries. Okay, so but one has to look at how relevant it is. Because in terms of separations, most of them are quits. They're not layoffs, okay? So when it's a quit, and then I think that's valid for most European countries, is that most of the separations for companies, they're due to quits and they're not due to layoffs. And this goes for Denmark as well. So there's a high turnover, but it's a turnover which is due to quits. And in that respect, the employment protection legislation doesn't really matter in terms of cost for the companies, okay? But it does matter, and I think this is really an important point to make as well when we talk about security. It does provide bargaining power for the worker. And I think that when we decrease the employment protection legislation, not only do we decrease kind of the costs, but we also decrease the bargaining powers for the workers and for trade unions. And that can be problematic because you shift the power balances on the labor market in a lot of different ways. By lowering the social protection, by lowering EPL and so forth, and you really shift the power balance in the labor market to an extent that you end up a little bit like in the UK, where there is no more power. Okay, and so when it becomes problematic, how do you want to rebalance that one? You know, what is it that you need to do to actually to rebalance the power balance between capital and labor to a certain extent? And to my eyes, you know, we kind of underestimate this effect and the implication it has for the way that labor markets function. So I don't think that the Danish, but I would say that Danish flexicurity maybe is becoming a myth. because there's been quite a lot of reforms lately, or a couple of very important reforms lately on the security side. They have halved the unemployment benefit duration from 4 years to 2 years. That's, kind of halving, and this was in the midst of the crisis. And secondly of all, in the social assistance system as well, they have cut the benefits as well. So on the security side, they're kind of on the benefit system cutting on the benefits. So you could say that, there is some recalibration of what was once known as the flexicurity model.
That's a bit. That's a bit too much for a question. I would like to answer two questions: the productivity question and the education question. Andres Apir. I think you are exactly right, and I believe that most of our analysis is too much focused on the labor market and too little focused on education and the transition from school and university to work and the human capital endowment that workers develop during formal education and afterwards. And I believe that most of the differences and the performances of the labor markets are to be looked at under this perspective as well. I think as for the transition from school to work or university to work, Italy is traditionally in a weak situation because traditionally, culturally, we always have thought of the formal education and the job market as two separate entities, and still now this is the case. It's intrinsically in the minds of everybody. It's a cultural trait of the country. What we have been doing this year is we are shifting the incentives, the hiring incentives on the youth. So we are moving billions of euros from hiring incentives to everybody, which we did in the start of the Jobs Act, as I explained before. We are focusing only on the youth, and this is hard politically because the youth usually don't vote, or if they vote against the system. So it's politically it's a hard decision to make, but we did it. So this budget law is focused on hiring incentives on the youth, and particularly with this view of the transition from school and university to work. So we are basically subsidizing the first open-ended contract, the first in the sense your first job after school or after university. And the idea is exactly what I think what you said. It's trying, of course, this is only the monetary part, hiring incentive. Around it, there is some measure on the incentive to the dual apprenticeship. We have a strange type of apprenticeship. We have an apprenticeship that it's rather a first contract, contract work contract in the job market separate from schooling. We have a weak dual apprenticeship system, which we are trying to finance in this budget law, and we are trying to financing and we are trying to develop in a better way the technical universities. We have very little effort. We have put very little effort so far on the technical universities. We had in the past very strong technical high schools during the 60s, 70s, up to the 70s. Then when we moved from a situation where most of the population had a high school degree to the need to provide a university degree to everybody, we lost this advantage on technical schools, and we never gained, as instead Germany did, and also France has a very strong two types of university system: the formal university and the technical schools. We never developed the technical schools at the tertiary education. This is a very weak point, and we are financing it now. So we are taking care of this transition, the issue of transition from school and university to work. We are taking care in this budget law with a combined type of measures with at the center these incentives. Productivity is a very hard thing to tackle, and I believe there is very much confusion everywhere as to what to do, apart from the fact that everybody knows that more education or a better quality education is the driver, but then of course there are many other drivers that are very hard to tackle, and probably there is no single thing that you can do to increase productivity in the short run. You have to take measures that probably give benefits in the course of 10 years or more.
Yes, I would like to first make a small comment on what Maria said about the German issue. I think this is a bit of a general insight, saying, well, if you start to regulate some sort of non-standard type of employment, we also have to observe, let's say, unintended side effects regarding other types of non-standard employment. And there's certainly a strong issue about, in a way, equalizing both flexibilities and also securities across different types of employment. Empirically, however, what it was not occurring in Germany was an increase in self-employment. So this did not happen as a response to temporary agency work becoming slightly more important or more costly. Yeah? So this did not take place. But there was somehow maybe a more heavy reliance on supplier firms that were not operating under the collective agreements of those main clients, yeah, and therefore a bit cheaper. The other thing that I also find very important when talking about this flexicurity debate is, I think, two things. One is that it is probably not easy to design a perfect system, but one has to rather go through a relatively protracted, sometimes contradictory sequence of reforms, responding also to some problem pressures or perceived problem pressures that just occur maybe as a side effect of some earlier reforms, and then to have to somehow adapt and maybe trying to improve the system over a longer period of time. And at the same time, one has to observe that the balance between risks and also security is definitely not equal for all types of or all groups in the labor force. So there's also an equity issue. Maybe it is inevitable in a situation of high unemployment and maybe strong employment protection for insiders to start questioning dismissal protection at some point and to liberalize temporary agency work first. But then in a second phase, then we have a discussion about expanding maybe the coverage of social insurance and maybe also re-regulating fixed-term contracts, for example. So I'm just taking a bit note of the political economy and maybe also the economic conditions under which all these reforms take place.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sick. I'm really sorry. It's already 3, so I won't have time to take a second on the column. But thank you very much for coming, all of you, and thanks to the speakers for joining us and accepting our invitation. It was a great panel. So thank you very much for your insights. Bye bye.